Oh, hello there, yes. It is again, isn't it? Except more so, yes. Must be all those DEI hires that's affecting the weather. Or is that wildfires? I always get confused. Anyway, yesterday was a busy news story day. Yes, very much sublime and ridiculous, and then just outright nastiness. But we'll come on to that at the end. Did have to smile at this one, which a lot of people picked up on from the Telegraph. A Truss sends Starmer cease and desist letter over claim she crashed the economy, in inverted commas you notice. Former Prime Minister's lawyers suggest comments contributed to her losing her seat in July general election. Now, leaving aside the farcical nature, which of 99.6% of the population are going to be indulging in with this, which I think is very much people's reaction, just the utter snowflakedness of it is really something else. We'll come on to Liz Truss's election failures, shall we say, but realistically, lawyers? Yes, anyway, the Daily Telegraph by yesterday afternoon had effectively buried this story. You can find it on their website, but you've got to basically type in the right words, shall we say. So just diving into the article, to back up their claims, Truss's lawyers cite a report from Andrew Lilko, a fellow of the IEA, a right-wing leaning think tank, yes, who you may recall were basically her economic advisors. So they have a certain vested interests in suggesting that, the reason why everything went the way that it did was, of course, because of the wokists and the blob and the junior doctors and DEI hires. Probably, or something. Mr. Lilko explains his feelings on a new episode of Planet Normal. Yes, you would call it that, wouldn't you? The podcast from Telegraph columnist Alison Pearson will come back to her and Liam Halligan, released on Thursday. Yes, and if you really want to torture your soul, you can watch that, can't you? But it's worthwhile going back to Ms. Truss's actual election victory. We'll come on to historical records a bit later on, but let's think about her actual election night. You may recall that she delayed the actual count because she was far too important to turn up initially. So here's Liz Truss, right? These are the numbers, okay? But yes, you remember the numbers don't lie unless, of course, the fraudulent wokists have managed to manipulate things. But here's Liz Truss, right? She got 25.3% of the vote, which was a drop of minus 43.4. Now, the Labour Party basically went through a gap between the Reform and James Baggy, I'm not really quite sure of how to pronounce it. I remember a few interviews with him, who was a local Conservative who very deliberately was standing against her, and probably if Reform had stood down might well have won the seat. But what basically happened to Liz Truss's vote share was that nobody came out to vote for her. Those staunch Tories didn't want to vote for her. Why? Well, as James did indeed point out in his election campaign, she was parachuted in to King's Lynn, Northwest Norfolk, or whatever the actual seat is, and the locals just hated her. She was a lousy constituency MP. So she's somehow blaming Keir Starmer, who said, she crashed the economy. You can use semantic different words to describe exactly what she was, but she was removed by her own party. She will forever be known as the laughing stock, Lettuce Liz, the woman, shortest serving PM because she didn't have the decency to die in the job, the woman who presided over the death of QE2, and the list goes on. But the one thing you don't think is, there was that relentless Labour Party campaign to, smear her as someone that was incompetent. Just doesn't add up, does it? Snowflakes that they are. Coming on to our second gorgeous thing from the Telegraph, we get Suella Braverman, who is always given a platform to spout utter tripe. Labour are about to wreck our schools. Yes, they're about to. You may recall from the last couple of years hearing all these stories about schools falling down because cement hasn't been fixed and basically there's no money for infrastructure. But apparently that must be Labour Party gremlins that are doing that, because they're about to unleash more of them. Education reform was one of the rare undoubted successes of the last Tory government, she says. Today's schools bill will undo all this work. And the astounding thing about this piece, and I'm going to quote from various sections of it, is that it manages to absolutely not just manipulate the truth, but mangle it, spit it out whilst laughing at it. So let's dive in. By any measure, Labour's favourite attack line, "You awful Tories caused the mess," in the first place, has had a good run. From net migration to tax burdens, defence spending and the Channel crossings, it's their go-to refrain. And truth be told, they're not always wrong. Good grief. Is that a rare sign of humility from Suella? Nah, not really. I've been frank about our shortcomings for some time now. Maybe not. Much to the chagrin of our more defensive colleagues. Maybe not. Yet I can't help but wonder how long Labour can coast on this strategy. 6 months, 12, that's the frustration of opposition, I suppose. Yes, I suppose so, but you see, whenever I read things like that, I think back to, things like, remember David Cameron? Now, David Cameron was the only person in the UK who didn't understand that leaving a note in Treasury saying, "I'm sorry, there's no money left," was actually basically a laugh, right? Yes, you, I, Suella Braverman and various DEI hires actually do understand that. But David Cameron had to pretend for donkey's years that he didn't. And even at the last election, people, senior cabinet members, were arguing that things would have been okay if only Labour hadn't handed them that mess in 2010. Yes, if only they'd done it better. That Gordon Brown. Do you remember, it was all Gordon Brown's fault, wasn't it? Everything was Gordon Brown's fault. All that immigration and everything, it was all, Suella Braverman, she did her best, but she couldn't do anything because it was all Tony Blair's fault, because he was the one who was pumping up the air in the small boats to bring them across the channel or something. Yes. I wonder how long they could keep that going for. Well, 14 years, I would imagine, Suella, but moving on. But there's one policy area where the line simply doesn't wash. Education. We'll move on. Here, the Conservatives' record is unassailable. It's no exaggeration to say that the reforms introduced under the last government transformed the landscape of British education. Yeah, it is. Leaving it in a far better shape than we found it. Nope. I would go further. Millions of children can read and count where they otherwise would not, thanks specifically to the Govian reforms pioneered in office. Now, here, Suella goes for one of those archetypal boomer sort of tropes, whereby everybody in the 1950s was incredibly literate and incredibly numerate. The problem with that, of course, is that reality doesn't actually back that up. We do have effectively what amounts to, in real terms, 100% literacy and numeracy rate in this country these days. Now, it is never going to be 100%, because you do get people with MLD, SLD, severe, specific, or moderate learning difficulties who will always struggle with these things. And there's always that percentage of the population with dyslexia and everything else. So you always end up with, say, 10, 15% of the population who have literacy and numeracy issues, right? Okay. But it's basically as close to people not being illiterate or innumerate as it can be, and it's the highest level it's ever been. And one of the reasons for that, of course, wasn't the last 14 years. I'm sorry, but it might have had something to do with Blair's reform. You may recall that Blair had 3 priorities in government: education, education, education. And I'm sorry, Suella, but, I've worked in education for the last 25 years, and I have this thing called, specialist knowledge, or just knowing stuff, and you're talking tosh there. Anybody who was involved in education during the late 1990s and early 2000s would have been very aware of the enormously much better resources that were going into things, particularly literacy. That particular one, with things like special education action zones and things like this. One of the legacies that was left from that was, for example, London schools, particularly with black and other minority communities that they were serving, did enormously well out of that, and still do to this day. Suella does go on inevitably about Miss Sniffy and the McKellar School, and isn't it all wonderful later on? But yeah, whatever. That is the legacy of Tony Blair. Now, the reason why the Tories will always tout their particular glorious stuff they did in education was when they came in 2010, and you may recall that in 2010 they were just going to have to make one or two little cuts here and there to pay down the debt, and then by 2015 we'd all be through it. One of the things they didn't cut was schools' budgets. They cut FE, they cut universities, and they cut support in terms of things like mental health stuff to children in schools. All that stuff was wrecked, right? Wrecked. But they didn't, for many years, touch the school's budget. And around about 2015, they kind of decided that that could go as well. Hence the concrete falling out of buildings that we have at the moment. You may remember at the end of Thatcherism we had the same thing. Now, I'm not saying that every time there's a long-standing Conservative government that basically schools fall down, but we've had it twice now. Maybe the next 15 years of a Tory Braverman, Brave New World will prove me wrong, but I'm sorry, I don't really have another lifetime to waste on that. Yes, moving on. In 2010, the picture was bleak. No, it wasn't. British schools languished near the bottom of OECD's PISA league tables for literacy and numeracy. No, we didn't. We were middle ranking. Fast forward to today, and we've climbed to 4th in the world for reading and 11th for maths. Yes, we have gone up in those too because this government has forever banged on about it. But you may notice there's one of the 3 big subjects that she's leaving out there. Yes, it's science, and we've dropped down enormously. Why? Because this government hasn't invested in science teachers. They simply can't employ people. Why? Because they have made teaching a lousy job to go into. When I went into teaching, there were distinct career opportunities. I personally wanted to be an advanced skills teacher, which is what you used to have in those days. Such things don't exist. These days, the idea is with a teacher that ideally you're not actually qualified to be a teacher and you can earn £20,000 a year. And when you get burnt out after 3 years, we don't care. You will just get another one. Except, of course, that game can't be played very often. Yes, anyway, that's just utter tosh. Yes, I admit that the emphasis that there has been on reading has brought us up in the PISA tables, but as ever, when you set targets like that, you just aim to meet them. And so many primary schools have spent so long on that as a single issue that, frankly, they don't want to do it anymore. In part, at least, the Labour Party new reforms. That transformation is no accident. It is a result of bold, determined policy led by Sir Nick Gibb and the relentless push for phonics, rigour and high expectations in classrooms. Now, yes, Nick Gibb, who's the schools minister. Now, not the education minister. I wonder why she hasn't mentioned the education minister. Well, because for a very long period of time under the Conservatives, the education minister was Gavin Williamson. Gavin Williamson, you may recall him. Yes, a byword for brilliance in his job and competence in the same way that Liz Truss is, yeah? Gavin Williamson was the Minister for Education. Leave it at that, okay? You can make up your own mind about how brilliant he was, but let's face it, nobody is going to say a good word about him. Yeah, Ofsted recent figures show that over 90% of schools now rated good or outstanding, up from just 68% in 2010. This is a legacy we should champion with pride. You see, and what Suella's doing here is not realising anything about schools. Okay, the criteria for Ofsted measuring schools in 2010 is completely different from the criteria for Ofsted measuring schools now. One of the basic problems that nobody in education, at least in senior political circles, is prepared to say about Ofsted is that basically if your school isn't looked at for 3 to 5 years, then the criteria for the new looking at them is going to be completely different from the one before. So how do we know how they're good or bad? It's a bit like those GCSEs. Do you remember when they were changed from A star down to 9 and down? Well, how do we measure between them? Well, we can't. And that's the idea, because that way we can say, oh, aren't these things very, very good? And look at all the brilliant changes we've made, because there's all these children now who don't get grade 9s. All these children that don't perform, which means we're winning. Yes, that was Michael Gove. Brilliant stuff, eh? Moving on. At the heart of this transformation was the 2011 Education Act, a piece of legislation whose importance cannot be overstated. Yeah, I can. I teach sociology, and we talk a lot about the marketisation of the British education system in terms of pluses and minuses. Quite a few pluses, an awful lot of minuses. By embedding a presumption in favour of free schools, come back to that one in a second, and granting greater autonomy to teachers and school leaders, the Act revolutionised how our schools operate. The result, a flourishing of excellence across the school system to what we termed the rising tide of competition. Yes, of course, because if you put competition into a system, you automatically get much better results. Just think about the water industry or trains or... No, don't. Obviously not, because you don't have competition in real terms, do you? Because it's not a free market, but that never bothers them. But just again, reality, going back to free schools. Free schools were a thing up until about 2015, and then the government realised that they were actually throwing vast amounts of money, wastefully, at loads and loads of schools in middle-class areas, which amounted to 200 children with a particular specialist bent, be it the Jewish school or a Muslim school or something like that, or whatever it might be, in some disused church or something, and it was costing them a fortune. So they just stopped doing them, basically, in that year, and they haven't done them since. The whole thing about giving schools greater autonomy was something, drumroll, that was brought in under Tony Blair. That's where your academies come from. So, no, I'm sorry, Suella, but you are telling, I don't know if you're deliberately telling lies here, probably you are that type of person, but this is just a farcical notion of history that is easily disproved by anybody with a cursory glance at any graphs anywhere. Anyway, moving on to enormously distasteful things, we actually have this from Alison Pearson. I'll leave a link to this, you can read it for yourself, but it is one of the most obnoxious pieces I think I've read in a very long period of time. Elon Musk has ripped the cloak of deceit off one of Britain's most disgusting scandals. Starmer's denunciation of Musk for spreading lies and misinformation about Muslim child rape gangs is an orchestra of discordant duplicity. Yes, she's been at the thesaurus, I think, again there. Anyway, I'm going to leave you to read that for yourself, but it made me feel physically ill reading it because it drips with that nastiness that only Alison Pearson can come up with. Yes, one can only think of, she must have been sat in her slippers and dressing gown while she was writing this, probably thinking about those brave soldiers that died, because that's the type of thing that she does. Incredibly nasty piece that drips, and the Telegraph have made this front and centre. In terms of their columnists, it's astounding what these people are allowed to write in terms of vitriol and bile. And then Liz Truss will complain that people have said that she crashed the economy. Jesus. Anyway, we're not even at the 10th of January yet. Do have a glorious stay warm weekend if you can do. And dear God, it's going to be such a year. It really will be.